This is for every wife who's ever watched her husband decide in real time that she wasn't good enough to claim in front of the right people. My name is Sarah Whitcombe. I'm 34 years old. 2 hours before my husband's company holiday party, he looked at my blazer, the same navy one I wear to work every day, and said, maybe wear something a little more interesting tonight. These are serious people, Sarah. I just don't want anyone assuming things about us based on what you do. An hour later, in front of his CEO, he put his hand lightly on my back and said, "This is Sarah. She's actually my neighbor, just tagging along tonight since her plans fell through." His boss looked at me for exactly 1 second too long, then said, "Sarah Whitcombe, from Cedar Trust?" My husband's smile didn't move, but everything underneath it did. If this story is already hitting you somewhere personal, hit subscribe and drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. Let me take you back to how we got to that ballroom. Because the lie David told that night didn't start there. It started 4 years earlier, the exact week I stopped being someone he wanted to explain, though. It took me most of those 4 years to recognize the pattern for what it actually was, instead of a dozen small, individually forgivable moments. David Whitcombe and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party in Cleveland back when he was a junior account manager at a small ad shop, and I was 2 years into my job as a loan officer at Cedar Trust Bank. He was funny back then, easy to talk to, genuinely curious about my work in a way that felt flattering instead of performative. He asked real questions about how commercial lending actually worked, took notes on his phone once when I explained debt-to-income ratios, like he genuinely wanted to remember it later. He used to joke that dating someone in banking meant he'd never have to worry about our finances, and I used to laugh, not realizing yet how much that joke would eventually curdle into something else. We married 3 years later, a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Chagrin Falls. 60 guests, nothing extravagant. My father walked me down a gravel path lined with mason jars full of wildflowers David and I had picked ourselves the week before. David cried during his vows, real tears, the kind that made my own mascara run in sympathy. I remember thinking standing there that I'd found someone who saw the actual shape of my life and wanted to be part of it, not someone I'd have to slowly edit myself down for. David's career took off around the same time he moved to Ridgeline Creative, a mid-sized advertising agency downtown, climbing from account manager to senior strategist within 2 years, working under a CEO named Michael Ridgeline, a sharp, image-conscious man who'd built the agency from nothing and cared visibly about the kind of people his team surrounded themselves with. David used to come home energized after client wins, describing the agency's culture in detail. The exposed brick offices, the rooftop happy hours, the casual mentions of vacation homes and boat clubs that seemed to define who belonged and who didn't. I stayed at Cedar Trust, moving up steadily, myself senior loan officer by 29, handling commercial accounts across the Cleveland metro area, a job I genuinely liked. Stable, respected within the industry, even if it didn't come with the kind of glamour David's agency friends seemed to prize. I liked the quiet satisfaction of helping a small business owner secure the financing that let them finally expand, or watching a struggling company's numbers stabilize after a restructured loan. It wasn't flashy. It had never needed to be, not until David started measuring things by a different scale. The shift happened slowly, the way most erosion does. At first, David's agency friends were just people we occasionally had dinner with, creative directors, junior partners, a few clients who'd become genuine friends. Then somewhere around year 3 of his time at Ridgeline, I started noticing the way he introduced me at those dinners. "This is my wife, Sarah. She's in finance," delivered quickly, almost apologetically, before the conversation pivoted immediately back to campaign strategy or client wins. Finance, not banking, not loan officer. Just finance, vague enough to sound impressive without inviting a follow-up question he seemed increasingly afraid of. I asked him about it once gently after a dinner where he'd practically talked over my one attempt to explain what my day actually looked like. A mid-sized manufacturing company I'd helped secure equipment financing for a story I thought was genuinely interesting. He cut in halfway through with a comment about a new client pitch, and the table's attention followed him instantly, the way attention always seemed to follow David in that room. Afterward in the car, I asked why he'd done that. He said I was overthinking it, that agency people just talked shop a lot, that it wasn't personal. I wanted to believe him. For a while I did. By year 4, the pattern had hardened into something harder to explain away. David started attending more industry events alone, telling me they'd be boring, mostly work talk, even when I knew from mutual friends that spouses were regularly invited and regularly attended. I found out about one such dinner, secondhand from Jonah's wife, who mentioned casually that she'd assumed I simply hadn't wanted to come. When I pushed back once, asking why I never got invited to the smaller client dinners anymore, he said carefully, "It's just, these are people who move in a certain world, Sarah. I don't want you to feel out of place. Out of place. Like I was a variable he was managing instead of a person he was married to." I started keeping a quiet private tally after that, not because I planned to use it for anything, but because I needed to know if what I was noticing was real, or if I was genuinely imagining it. 3 dinners I wasn't invited to over 4 months. 2 industry mixers he attended alone. A holiday card photo he'd asked me to retake, because the background looked too suburban for the version he wanted to send to his agency contacts. A LinkedIn post he'd written that mentioned his incredible support system without naming me once, even though I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. helping him rehearse the pitch that post was celebrating. Small things individually forgivable. Together, they told a story I didn't want to be true. 2 hours before the holiday party, Ridgeline Creative's biggest event of the year, held at the Renaissance Hotel downtown. 200 guests, including major clients, board members, and half the city's advertising scene. David stood in our bedroom doorway, watching me get dressed, arms crossed, studying me the way you'd study a display in a store window rather than a person. I'd pulled out my navy blazer, the one I actually liked. Professional and simple. The same one I'd worn to close a $2.3 million commercial loan the week before. Maybe wear something a little more interesting tonight, he said, not quite meeting my eyes, glancing instead at his own reflection in the mirror behind me. "These are serious people, Sarah. I just don't want anyone assuming things about us based on what you do." I asked him what exactly people might assume. He didn't have a real answer, just a vague gesture toward the closet, toward some version of me he seemed to think would embarrass him less. Something flashier, something that photographed better, something that wouldn't invite the question, "So, what do you do?" Followed by an answer he apparently found insufficiently impressive. I changed anyway into a dress I already owned, mostly because arguing about it felt like it would cost more than it was worth that night, and some tired, hopeful part of me still wanted the evening to go well. The Renaissance ballroom was full by the time we arrived, string quartet in one corner, an open bar, round tables with Ridgeline's logo etched into the centerpieces, easily 200 guests in cocktail attire, moving between conversations. David seemed nervous in a way I hadn't seen from him in months, checking his phone repeatedly, scanning the room like he was cataloging who'd already arrived, his hand finding the small of my back a little too firmly as we moved through the crowd, steering more than guiding. Michael Ridgeline found us within the first 20 minutes, flanked by 2 board members. I didn't recognize a woman in a deep green dress, who I'd later learn was the agency's largest institutional investor, and an older man who turned out to be Ridgeline's outside legal counsel, both of them nursing drinks and mid-conversation about a client pitch when we approached. Michael was exactly as I'd pictured him from David's descriptions. Sharp suit, firm handshake, the kind of practiced warmth that made you feel important for exactly as long as he needed you to. "David, glad you made it." His eyes moved to me, polite, curious, the kind of look that clocks a stranger and files them away for later small talk. "And who's this?" David's hand found the small of my back again, light, almost performative, the gesture of a man narrating a scene rather than living inside one. "This is Sarah. She's actually my neighbor, just tagging along tonight since her plans fell through." I felt the words land somewhere behind my ribs before I fully processed them. Neighbor. 4 years of marriage, a vineyard ceremony, mason jars of wildflowers we'd picked together, and in front of his boss, I'd become a neighbor whose plans had fallen through. Michael's expression shifted, something flickering across his face that wasn't quite recognition. yet more like a memory trying to surface through 200 other faces in the room. "Sarah Whitcombe?" he said slowly, tilting his head slightly. "From Cedar Trust?" The name landed in the space between us like something dropped from a height. David's smile stayed technically in place, but everything beneath it changed his shoulders, tightening his hand going still against my back. "You two know each other?" David asked. His voice pitched slightly too casual, a smile fixed carefully in place like something he'd rehearsed in a mirror. "We spoke on the phone Tuesday," Michael said, still studying my face like he was double-checking his own memory against it. "Sarah's the senior loan officer handling our commercial line renewal, the one that's supposed to close by end of month." He paused, something clicking fully into place behind his eyes. "Whitcombe. I didn't put it together. David, is Sarah your wife?" The word hung there. My wife. Not my neighbor. The correction sat in the air, obvious to everyone standing close enough to hear it, including the two board members who exchanged a glance. I wasn't meant to see Renata's eyebrows lifting just slightly, the legal counsel beside her going very still, in the particular way people go still when they've just watched something socially expensive happen in real time. David hesitated half a second too long enough that the hesitation itself became its own small confession. "Yes," he said finally. "She's my wife." Michael's eyebrows rose slightly, genuine surprise breaking through his practiced composure for just a moment. "Interesting that you introduced her as your neighbor, then. I want you to sit with that moment for a second. The exact second your husband's boss says out loud in front of a room full of people. The thing you've been quietly noticing for over a year. Have you ever had someone else name a pattern you'd been too afraid to name yourself? Tell me in the comments, because that single sentence from Michael Ridgeline did more for me in 5 seconds than a year of my own doubt had managed to do." David laughed too quickly, the kind of laugh people use to paper over something they can't undo. "Long story," he said. "Force of habit. I guess we live 2 doors down from our actual neighbors gets confusing. It was a lie built on top of a lie, and I watched Michael's face register that too, his polite smile tightening at the edges. "Well?" Michael said, turning his attention fully to me now deliberately, in a way that felt like a correction of its own. "Sarah, it's genuinely good to put a face to the file. Your team's been thorough. We appreciate the extension you pushed through last month. That bridge financing kept 3 of our accounts payable current through a rough stretch. I mean that. I'm glad it helped," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands weren't entirely. David, Michael added almost as an afterthought. "Though it landed with real weight, you might have mentioned your wife was the one holding our commercial line together. Would have saved me a very stressful phone call trying to figure out if we needed a backup lender." David didn't have an answer for that either. The rest of the party moved around us the way parties do. Conversations. Drinks refreshed the string quartet, shifting into something livelier, but the air between David and me had changed entirely. He stayed close to me for the remainder of the evening, quieter than usual, introducing me correctly now. To everyone we spoke with his wife Sarah, though the correction felt less like generosity and more like damage control. Michael's assistant, a woman named Priya, found me near the dessert table about an hour later and said quietly, almost kindly, "For what it's worth, Michael talks about your bank's underwriting team like they hung the moon. He didn't know who you were tonight, but he already respected you plenty before he did. It wasn't much, but it helped more than I expected it to." One of David's colleagues, a creative director named Jonah, who I'd met a handful of times over the years, pulled me aside near the coat check as we were leaving. "Sarah?" he said, hesitating slightly, shifting his weight like he wasn't entirely sure he should be saying anything at all. "I've heard David call you someone in finance, probably a dozen times over the years. I always just assumed you worked at like an insurance office or something." He shook his head. "You basically kept this whole agency's lights on last month and none of us knew your actual name." The green-dressed board member, whose name turned out to be Renata Cole, caught me by the coat check too briefly, just long enough to say I sit on the finance committee here. "I've seen your bank's name on our credit line paperwork for 2 years. It's a strange world running into the actual person behind it at a holiday party." She said it kindly, but I could hear underneath it the same quiet incredulity everyone else seemed to be circling that David had spent this long, letting people assume less of me than the truth actually offered. The drive home was silent for the first 10 minutes, the city lights sliding past the windshield, while neither of us said anything. Have you ever sat in a silence like that, knowing the conversation waiting at the end of it was going to change something permanently? I want to know if you've been there. Tell me in the comments, because I spent those 10 minutes rehearsing about 6 different versions of what I might say, and none of them felt like enough. David finally spoke somewhere around the highway exit near our neighborhood, the real one, not the one he'd invented that night. "I'm sorry," he said. I don't even know why I said neighbor. It just came out. His voice cracked slightly on the word neighbor, like even saying it a second time made him hear how strange it sounded out loud. "It didn't just come out, David," I said. "You've been doing a version of that for over a year. Finance instead of banking, skipping the dinners, the comment about my blazer 2 hours ago. Tonight, you just finally said the quiet part, loud enough for someone else to catch it." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "I think I got embarrassed somewhere along the way." He admitted about what people at Ridgeline would think of a wife who works at a bank instead of doing something that sounds impressive at a dinner party. "I know how that sounds. I know it's not fair to you." "It's not fair to either of us," I said. "You've spent a year managing how I look to people whose opinion of me apparently matters more than mine does to you." We didn't resolve everything in the car that night. What we did instead over the following weeks was actually talk real conversations, some of them uncomfortable, about status, about the specific kind of insecurity David had built up around his own career, about how easily that insecurity had turned into something that cost me dignity I hadn't agreed to spend. He told me one night at the kitchen table that he'd grown up watching his own father get quietly dismissed at social gatherings for being just a mechanic, and that some part of him had spent his entire adult life terrified of being seen the same way. Terrified enough, apparently, that he'd started managing how I looked, instead of examining why the fear existed in the first place. Michael Ridgeline emailed me directly the following Tuesday, formally thanking Cedar Trust for the renewal terms, and mentioning almost as a postscript that he hoped to see me at more agency events going forward, properly introduced. This time he wrote a small, pointed kindness that I appreciated more than he probably realized. I forwarded the email to David without comment. He read it standing in our kitchen and didn't say anything for a long moment. David went to couples counseling with me starting in January, a decision he made without my having to push for it, which mattered more to me than the sessions themselves. Our therapist, a calm, direct woman named Dr. Nasser, asked him once plainly what he thought his coworkers would have actually said if he'd introduced me correctly from the start. He didn't have a good answer. I don't think there was one. She asked a follow-up question that stuck with both of us longer than anything else in those early sessions: whether the version of respect he'd been chasing from his colleagues was worth more to him than the version he owed the person he'd actually married. He didn't answer that one out loud either, but I watched him sit with it for a long time. We went to 11 sessions that spring, some of them tense, a few of them genuinely healing in a way I hadn't expected therapy to feel. Dr. Nasser had David write out 1 week every instance he could remember of introducing me as something less than his wife, going back as far as he could recall. He came back the following session with a list longer than either of us had braced for small comments at conferences, a work trip, where he'd apparently told a colleague he was not seeing anyone seriously, an entire year of holiday cards he'd deliberately kept off his desk at the office. Reading that list out loud in front of Dr. Nasser seemed to do something for him that my own explanations hadn't managed to do alone. 6 months later, David and I attended Ridgeline's summer client mixer, together held this time on the agency's rooftop terrace. String lights instead of a string quartet, a much smaller crowd than the holiday party had been. He introduced me himself unprompted to nearly everyone we spoke with. "This is my wife, Sarah. She's a senior loan officer at Cedar Trust," delivered plainly without the old flinch underneath it, without the careful vagueness that used to precede it. I watched him say it to 3 different clients that evening, each time a little more naturally than the last, like a muscle finally remembering how it was supposed to move. Michael found us early in the evening, shook my hand properly this time, and said, "Good to see you both." Properly this time. David actually laughed a real one, and didn't look away, didn't glance around the room to gauge who might be watching the exchange. Renata Cole waved from across the terrace, calling out something about the renewed credit line's favorable terms, loud enough that a few nearby clients turned to listen, and David didn't flinch at that either. I don't know if David will ever fully understand what that year cost me, not the party itself, but the accumulation of small omissions that led up to it, each one small enough to argue away until they added up to something that finally had a name. But I watch him differently now at the events we do attend together, not bracing for the moment he decides I'm inconvenient to explain, because I finally trust that he's stopped deciding that at all. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever been introduced as less than what you actually are by someone who was supposed to claim you. Fully tell me what it felt like when the truth finally caught up. I want to know we're not alone in this. My husband spent a year quietly deciding which version of me was acceptable to introduce, and it took one boss, one phone call he'd forgotten I was on the other end of, and 5 uncomfortable seconds in a hotel ballroom to prove exactly which version of me had been holding both of us up the whole time. I still think about the way Michael said my name that night. Half a question, half a memory clicking into place, and how much smaller David's careful lie looked the instant it met an actual fact standing right in front of it. Lies like that only survive in rooms where nobody who knows the truth happens to walk in. That night someone did, and I'm honestly grateful it happened the way it did in public, with witnesses, instead of quietly, where David might have kept finding smaller and smaller versions of the same lie for years, without anyone ever catching it out loud. I don't think David is a bad person. I think he's a person who let a very ordinary insecurity grow unchecked for years, until it started costing someone else, instead of just him. I've forgiven him for that. Mostly, though. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. It came in the same slow, deliberate way. Trust rebuilds after anything gets broken. One correctly delivered introduction at a time. One uncomfortable therapy session at a time. One summer rooftop party where he finally said my actual job title out loud without flinching.